Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Gabriel Jaja, producer. In this episode, we bring you a conversation between Acton's Director of Communications, Eric Kohn, and Congressman Peter Meijer, who took office in January as the representative for Michigan's 3rd Congressional District and recently visited the Acton Building. They discuss bipartisanship, leadership, the often counterintuitive incentive structure that exists in the U.S. Congress, and much more. You can find additional resources in the show notes of this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. If you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen.
Elected in 2020, Congressman Peter Meijer is a Republican representing Michigan's 3rd District, which is home to Grand Rapids and the Acton Institute. Prior to being sworn in as a member of Congress in January 2021, Meijer attended the United States Military Academy at West Point. Soon thereafter, he enlisted in the Army Reserves and deployed to Iraq, where he conducted intelligence operations to protect American and Allied forces. Following his service in Iraq, Meijer joined Team Rubicon, a veteran-based disaster response organization, and then a conflict analysis NGO in Afghanistan. After leaving Afghanistan, he received his MBA from New York University. Congressman Peter Meijer, welcome to Acton Line.
Thank you for having me on.
Why did you want to be in Congress?
To get things done, to move the country in a better direction, to try to get over the mismatch between short-term electoral incentives and long-term governing incentives.
How's that going?
Step by step, day by day.
Day by day. I mean, as I'm reminded of T.S. Eliot, that people tend to think that some things will never happen, but it's in the words of T.S. Eliot, there's no such thing as a truly lost cause. There's no such thing as a truly won cause. So it does give us some hope in all of that. So, as you've been in Congress for about 5 months now. Mm-hmm. I was looking at some Axios analysis the other day that you are, amongst the freshman class, one of the most bipartisan members of Congress. Is that something that you set out intentionally to do and to be? Did it just kind of present itself as opportunities? Because we hear so much about polarization, the inability to work across the aisle. I'm interested as someone who seems to be doing it, how it's going, and if you think there's any chance of that growing.
So one thing to understand is obviously having a democratically controlled House. Your bill doesn't get to the floor if you don't have a bipartisan co-sponsor. If you're a Democrat, your bill has a lower chance of getting introduced if it doesn't have a bipartisan co-sponsor. I serve on the Homeland Security, Foreign Affairs, and Science, Space, and Technology committees. None of those are reflexively partisan, right? You don't have traditional liberal versus conservative issues. There may be some quibbling and disagreement kind of on the margins on the extent of engagement in one place or the dynamics of action in another. But by and large, I serve in areas where there is broad agreement and where the issues that are being put forth often many of the bills I co-sponsor, they just go on the suspension calendar, right? They pass out of committee unanimously. There's not a ton of dissension on whether or not to condemn China's treatment of the Uyghur population, right? That's going to get overwhelming support because it's just acknowledging a truth. So I would say I didn't intend to be – well, I obviously wanted to be productive, and I think in order to be productive, it helps to engage in a bipartisan and trusted way. A lot of that score is not bipartisanship for appearance's sake, but because we're working on issues of legislation, whether it's on dealing with veterans, whether it's dealing with military or national security, that just lend themselves inherently to reaching across the aisle.
Do you think there's a problem with the incentive structure in Congress that there are other members, of course, of the freshman class who don't appear anywhere near you on that analysis and don't seem as interested. So part of it, I take your point that it's the nature of the issues that you're working on. But, as you mentioned, given the makeup of the House and all of that, if you want to move things forward, you need to be bipartisan. But it would seem that there are people just less interested in that. Is that a cultural thing that you've observed?
Oh, I mean, you asked me the question, is there a problem with incentives? I mean, the obvious answer is yes. I remember one colleague who was being stripped of committees. She called a press conference. I think we had a competing press conference. One or two cameras showed up when we were talking about authorizations for use of military force, right, or things that are actually tangibly important and deal with whether or not the president can send men and women to die in the name of the country. Right? These are lofty, weighty issues that would barely get any attention. Meanwhile, the camera kind of flocks to the political car accident, right, to kind of gawk and stare. So it makes sense that things are going to trend towards the extremes, right? People, to paraphrase Dimitri Martin, nobody spray paints Toy Story 2 was okay. It's going to be it's going to be love or hate, and a lot of what Congress does is or should be a little bit boring. It may have very impactful outcomes, but it doesn't lend itself to, well, the people who are doing it are evil on this side and the ones who are trying to stop it or there's a lot more gray in many of those issues than I think our media and our entertainment cycle really amplify. And so the more that we can get away from simplistic narratives, the far better off we can be. But the challenge is, I mean, we view our world through narrative constructs. And that's just part of the human condition. So it'll inherently be a balancing act between who we are as individuals and what this is. But it's certainly the case that if you're looking to find meaning and entertainment in politics, the politics becomes the worst when it seeks to offer both of those.
I actually want to focus in on that. And before we zoom out to it, I want to ask you about your congressional experience. What was the most and least surprising things you've encountered?
I would say the least surprising was just how the incentive is not geared towards that if you just kind of go with the flow. And we had some very difficult votes early on. I would say that the least surprising was that there were folks who just didn't care. Right? Not a lot of them, but there's an argument in a debate over whether a representative is more of a fiduciary, right, where you are given a trust to exercise judgment, and or whether your job is to figure out what a majority of the individuals in your district care about at any one time and represent that. And I would add an asterisk that oftentimes it's not what a majority of your constituents feel; it's what a majority of your supporters within your half of the constituency would feel at any one point in time. I obviously take the former approach that we have. Yes, we're a democracy. We're also a republic, and we try to balance those two philosophies between mob rule on the one hand, while protecting things that we feel a little bit more sacred, and recognizing the fact that people change their minds. People are persuadable. What somebody passionately believes one day, we not only should expect that they may change or alter some components of that in time, or not even just believe, but how they view and judge a situation, that they may change over time, but that we want to let people change their minds. I think that's one of the dangerous things about, I hate the term cancel culture, but it's the best term for this, that there's no accounting for maturation. There's no accounting for evolution. It's, well, you had a wrong think opinion 2 decades ago. How dare you, regardless of where you are today, right? That we should all be so perfect as the inquisitors, but specifically on where I was off, on that least surprising component, I would say the most surprising, and this is what I really struggle with, is I'd always had the assumption that there's somebody who has a plan, right? You just need to find the right person, and not that that's a substitute, but I'm a freshman member, right? Been here less than 6 months. I can diagnose a lot of the things that I see that are not functioning well, but I'm not going to be so arrogant as to think that I have the solutions for those right now, right? And it's just that hope that maybe there is somebody with more experience and, that can kind of have a deeper well to draw from and has an insight and a vision. And I would say the most surprising was just that I haven't really found that person exists. And I have to say, I am reflexively opposed to conspiratorial thinking, not because I don't believe somebody could try to – there isn't a malevolent, individuals who wouldn't want to have that happen. I've never met anyone vaguely capable of carrying out, a mass deception, right? Anyone who served in the military, the intelligence community, or anything else, I mean, the fact that people just are they'll get drunk at a bar and they'll say something, right? They'll want to boast and brag, or they'll just
As the pollster Kristen Soltis Anderson, I thought always had a great way of putting it when she was asked what surprised her about coming to Washington was she went there hoping it would be the Aaron Sorkin West Wing. Yeah. Everyone told her it would be House of Cards. It's Veep.
Yeah.
So. You'd mentioned
even that gives them a little bit too much credit because in Veep, some people knew what they were doing.
Yeah. You mentioned persuasion in there. I often think that we have this totalizing view of a lot of things in life now where we think, it's all one thing, it's all another thing, that there's and it seems to me and it seems to a lot of people that there isn't a lot of persuasion that's going on. There's not a lot of people trying to make an argument that they're – for what politics actually is, right? You're better served being in my coalition than the one you're in now. Is it something that's going on and we're just kind of missing it because so much attention is geared towards some of the craziness out there, or perhaps it is going on but there just isn't enough of it?
I think it exists, but it almost exists more at the personal relationship level, right? Like you won't be persuaded by somebody that you can immediately discount or say, well, they're only saying that because X or Y or Z, right? And we have it within the right. It's like, well, I'm not going to listen to anything this person says because they're MAGA or because they're never Trump or, these just baseline rejections that prevent you from being able to say, all right, let's step beyond whatever we're getting our dukes up for, right? And them's fighting words. And it's the exact same thing on the left where, I mean, it's just there's always a degree of ad hominem and that it's like, well, I don't need to listen to what this person says because they had some opinion I disagreed with. So that makes it a bit more challenging on the persuasion side in general and just the overall balkanization, right? Like you don't have, partially because of the tribal sorting on a lot of issues, you don't have people naturally convening or coalescing around an issue where there are differences of opinion in other places, right? I mean, you used to have, pro-life and pro-choice Democrats. Or you used to have pro-life Democrats. You used to have pro-choice Republicans, right? You used to have, Republicans who advocate for gun control and kind of more hardline blue dog Democrats who were strong proponents of the Second Amendment.
40 years ago, if I asked if you were Republican or Democrat, I'd have to ask a follow-up question to find out if you were liberal or conservative, and it's sorted.
And I think that creates a homogenizing belief structure where everybody you talk to – or you assume that everyone believes as you do because those who you associate with believe as you do as well. I quipped earlier, if I were king for a day, what were the one thing I would propose? And it would be some degree of mandatory national service because right now, with the exception of jury duty and the post office, if you have enough money or you're in the right circumstance, you choose where you live, you choose where you work, you choose where you go to school. All of those associations allow Americans to have just vastly different and individualized paths, which is a wonderful thing. But we're very big, we're very broad, we're a very diverse country. And if we seek to operate as a whole, there needs to be that sense of understanding and empathy. And how do we force folks from vastly disparate backgrounds to get on a same mission and on the same team? Well, I mean, standing in line at the post office or maybe getting called up for jury duty. I mean, those are the only two kind of shared national things that we have.
And even still, those are things that, for the most part, we try to avoid, right? You go to FedEx if you want to make sure that something you're shipping is going to get there, and you try to get out of jury duty if you have to get out of jury duty. I'm curious with that. You'd spoken to our staff here at Acton prior, and you'd mentioned that King for a Day idea. It seems focused around the idea of building a sense of community. Do you think that can be built through something compulsive like that is required of you? How much do you think that there is that kind of part of the American spirit that rejects being told what to do, that will recoil from that it could have that as an unintended consequence?
Oh, no. I mean, I would expect that most folks would dread it and hate it and would bond in their shared dreading and hating, right? I mean, that was the most beautiful thing of the military, was just you were miserable, but you were miserable with a bunch of people. And I still haven't – there's got to be a German word for this, but that moment in which something is like the misery compounds to a comical degree, and you're just like, I'm so cold and so wet and so tired, and I'm actually loving this right now. I mean, you just like tip past the point of being annoyed to just – throwing your arms
almost
up.
Amused by how bad it is.
I could say it couldn't get worse, but it probably could. But that sense of like you don't – if you have no bounds, right, if you have every opportunity think of hydraulic fluid, right? I mean, it takes on its strength when it's put under pressure. You take that pressure away and it just oozes all over the place. I think a lot of individuals have those characteristics, but who you are as an individual is almost inherently going to be defined against who you're not, and it's going to be defined in those contrasting moments. And that's what I think is one of the wonderful things about military service, is it offers you time and again contrasting opportunities to learn. That was a combination of learn and grow to learn and to grow and to kind of step beyond what you have, and even if that means you're creating a shared experience in rebellion, that shared experience can be very powerful and helpful.
I should trademark Low. It's got vision and creativity, visitivity. What's your philosophy on public service? Because you're a public servant now. You're a member of Congress. What was your philosophy I asked you why you wanted to be in Congress. It gets back to that a little bit, but it's a bit of what motivated you. But what is your philosophy on how you're trying to be a public servant?
I think I would say there are two main components. One is what I call just don't be a hypocrite, right? Have some intellectual honesty and consistency, and that perhaps in my searching for that, there are some times where I will say, well, I'll be honest, I do not know, right? Not, or I have my instinct, but I don't like to extend too far beyond my own education or experience. That's not to say that a bill comes up that is completely outside of a domain that I'm familiar with, right? Afghanistan, right? When I was in Afghanistan, I was probably one of the top 10 or 15 analysts in the country. I was briefing ambassadors, right? I was contributing to think tank reports. I don't need to think too long and hard to have a strong opinion or to evaluate what direction I feel would be most beneficial. When it comes to entitlement reform, again, I have my baseline instincts, but I want that to be borne out by an evidentiary analysis as well, right? So I may not be as eager to grasp onto a track until I've had time to analyze and to study. So that the goal of intellectual honesty and non-hypocrisy, so that I can consistently call balls and strikes, that's not dependent on what color the jersey that the batter is wearing. Right?
Well, at least with – I think it may be something else, or at least as I'm hearing it, is at least with hypocrisy, it reveals an underlying ideal. The ideal exists and you're not living up to it, which, is not always necessarily great. But I think the far worse thing would be to just say either the ideal doesn't exist or shouldn't exist because people are inconsistent about it. And I think we hear way too much argument for that these days.
Oh, I mean, it's at least, with hypocrisy, what's the
tribute that virtue pays to vice.
Yeah, exactly.
Or vice pays to virtue, yeah.
But if you didn't have any virtue to begin with, then you couldn't be hypocritical.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of one of the ironic things about some – and I try to not refer to folks in the concrete sense, so I have a bit more liberty about one particular Florida congressman. It almost can't be hypocritical if there's no virtue to begin with, if it's just pure, unabashed ego. There's something fascinating about that, but also incredibly reprehensible, assuming the allegations are borne out. When it comes to the other goal, it's to always be thinking in that long term, right? I mentioned at the very beginning that maturity mismatch between short-term electoral incentives and long-term governing incentives. It's very easy to think about something and just think of what the immediate consequence is going to be. It's much harder to work out that n+1, n+2. What are the secondary and third order effects that I need to be considerate of? When I look at a decision like January 6th and the consequences of that, the non-hypocrite in me, the one who wants to have a virtue, even if occasionally vice gets in, would say, okay, shoes on the other foot. What would we do if the presidents were reversed, right? What would we do if crazy, zany scenario, but if Obama was the president and he encouraged a mob to prevent him from, getting replaced by Mitt Romney in 2012, I'm pretty sure the Tea Party would probably not cotton to that, right? I'm pretty sure that a lot of those folks looking for excuses and rationality and rationalizations and sort of backpedaling would be grabbing pitchforks. So it's hard to defend those searching for false equivalencies and bad faith arguments. And when those false equivalencies and bad faith arguments become almost like a mobilizing, organizing factor, you can't help but just assume that things are way astray. And in ways that I think are not viscerally evident, but are incredibly – but that honestly scare me because there's no consistency. It's just unmoored, untethered. And that could easily go in good directions. The wind could take it in a very positive direction, or it could not.
Why are we having such a difficult time thinking long term like that in politics and government and in culture? I mean, there is very much a here and now. I mean, I have my own theories on it that I think part of it has to do with just the rapidity of information. That we talked a lot about a couple of years ago the Sohrab Ahmari broadside against David French that kind of launched in the philosophical world this conversation about post-liberalism. And one of the things that I observed that to me was fascinating was here's a guy in New York City talking about something that happened in Sacramento, California. And if you were to go back 30 years when the internet really isn't a thing, we don't have social media, and you were to say that, hey, there's this thing going on in Sacramento where drag queens are reading storybooks to children, you would hear in Grand Rapids, the person would probably go, huh, that's weird. And then you'd move on with your day. But now things seem, even if they're far away, like they're right next door. So we deal with everything in the immediate rather than thinking long-term about things. I'm curious from your perspective and experience why you think that seems to be a trend.
I think there's also a certain arrogance that our hubris, that our access to information and our assumption that we can optimize and control the world. There's a hubris that lens that I think extends into a lot of other realms where we can't just say we don't know or, well, our best guess is this. I mean, look at the CDC's guidance around the coronavirus. It has to be it's going to be absolute. That we can, at the touch of our fingertips, access generations of or millennia of information and just of untold largesse really flies in the face of a lot of what we should be practicing, which is a degree of humility. Like I can access this, but is that definitive? Can I know everything? And I think when it comes to politics, and you see this with kind of conspiracy theorists on both sides, and I've had many a conversation here where we assume that all knowledge that fits our priors, can stand without questioning, and I tend not to be preachy in a lot of realms because I'm still learning. I'm still grappling. I'm still those who speak most assuredly are oftentimes the people that flame out the fastest because they lose any sense of gut check of saying, well, this is my best operating assumption, but things might change, right? So I just don't – I think our brains are broken on the one hand from this little phone that keeps ringing here. Our brains are utterly broken with that sort of dopamine addiction hit, right? And that assumption that we can access anything and that we have perfect knowledge and that we can optimize and that there's no room for chance. There's no room for serendipity. There's no room for any of kind of the mysteries of life to kind of come in. And I tend to think that those mysteries of life force a degree of humility, force a degree of openness to maybe I'm not right about this, right? We should have our operating assumption, but we should also be questioning that from time to time. And I think you see nothing of that in some of the messianic fervor in some areas of our politics. You see nothing of that humility or that doubt or just hey, I'm going to keep an open mind. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, those are incredibly rare characteristics because if you are on the side of right, then the other has to be on the side of wrong. And if you're on the side of right, then you're why question that? Why doubt?
On your Twitter bio, you describe yourself as a subsidiarity proponent. Give me your thoughts on that, and how would you distinguish that from the thread both amongst politicians and amongst some sectors of the right now, talking about a conception of the common good animating their approach to everything?
Yeah, I've yet to be really sold on common good conservatism or, frankly, any of the sort of philosophical spaghetti on the wall, see what sticks type of approaches we're seeing from all components, mostly because just about every single one seems to blame. And I've never really fully understood this because having, at least in my short time in Washington, I've yet to see any libertarian have any real purchase or control over anything.
But they run everything.
And yet they're somehow the enemy. But how everything has this strain of populism, and it can be more cloaked in a softer blanket with common sense good or in a harder blanket like some of the national populism efforts. None of it changes the fact that it's a bunch of folks running to the front of the parade, grabbing the baton and pretending to lead it, right? I mean, that's I guess I'm a fan that they're trying. That's good, but not really sold that there's anything there. That a broader sense of where do we go from here on sort of that right, I tend to start with, well, what has been demonstrated to work, right? And this is where I come to subsidiarity. What has been demonstrated to work? What institutions do you see that run well? I think county road commissions function very, very well because they are one of the lower levels of government that can analyze its needs, have long-term capital asset management plans. Right, I drive on some of those.
And a singularity of purpose, right?
Singularity of purpose, and it is who's paying and what they're receiving is pretty well identified, and that's not to get into too much statutory rev share on the state side, right? But then you look at entities that don't function well, and they tend to be of amorphous purpose. They tend to be abstracted from the consequence of their everyday actions, and some of that's going to be inherent, right? You're not going to have the Department of Homeland Security, very nebulous, right? I'm on the committee, and we were in this center where it was very big and fancy and talking about how they react to various incidences. And I was like, where's your product going? Oh, this product is to figure out how we will react internally to a pipeline disruption. Oh, so it's not how the country reacts. No, it's how we react. Okay. So you have these kind of wheels within wheels in some of these agencies where you can't help but think of the Office Space lines. Like, so what exactly do you do around here? I'm a people person. You see that a lot more at the federal government than you do at a state and local, where you have a clearly defined what is your responsibility, who is responsible for this, and if you don't do it, it doesn't get done. We feel a lot more the presence or an absence of a mayor or a governor than, frankly, we do of a president. right? You could have, if the trash isn't getting picked up, if the police aren't out on the streets, like you feel that. And to me, there's no better way of trying to reprise and kind of get away from this abstraction and this rudderlessness of our federal government than to return it to that more closely held, continuously justify and or continuously have a justification for your actions rather than just going on federal autopilot as we have.
And on those lower levels, you know who to fire too, right? If something's not getting done, there's someone to hold accountable. And I juxtapose that in my mind with the
bureaucracy.
Well, yes, or even just some of the way that things function within the body that you serve in the other chamber of it. I remember the senator from Colorado during the previous administration having a freak out that they would remove the memo from the Department of Justice saying that there wouldn't be federal prosecutions in states that have lifted or have legalized marijuana, and demanding that advisory guidance be replaced. When you're a senator, you can introduce legislation. You can work on these things in a way that it's harder to not be held accountable if you're the road commissioner and the roads aren't getting fixed.
Well, because you can always claim credit, whether or not that credit deserves to be claimed. Mm-hmm. You can always be blamed, whether or not that blame deserves to be owned. But so much, I think, of the challenges that our responsibility, accountability set up in this country is not geared towards credit where credit is due. It's geared towards blame avoidance at all cost. As long as I'm able to wash my hands of it, then I'm fine, right? Not my problem. And yet I think in our foreign policy, I think that was one of President Obama's failings with the Syrian conflict, is thinking that he could just wash his hands of it and ignore. There's some things that whether you like to or not, you're going to be forced to deal with. On a domestic context, there's a lot more you start to see kind of that ball rolling in the opposite, I don't have a really good analogy for this, but it's a lot more problematic to try to stop something bad from happening, even if you end up, causing a better outcome, because you can't. You'll only be blamed for what did happen, not what didn't. And at the end of the day, I think government's role should be to be thinking long term, thinking ahead, rather than just focusing on the immediate here and now. But the here and now is all the public is thinking about too, which means it should be the responsibility of your elected officials to be thinking long term. So we're not heading towards this cliff, right? If you're just, at the local level, you see it with, well, how come our pensions are out of balance? Well, because Mayor so-and-so or Councilman whatever negotiated a terrible deal that they should be held responsible for and punished. If you're trying to figure out, well, how come our federal debt just went to $30 trillion, who are you going to blame to that? There's a lot of blame to go around, but none of it's actually going to stick.
And when everybody's guilty of everything, nobody's guilty of anything.
Yeah. That's why I just vote no all the time. Right? I actually do vote.
As we mentioned,
the bipartisan.
Yes. You're in Congress. Legislation is the tool at your disposal. What do you think is the biggest problem we're facing now that can't be solved through legislation?
I would say how we have taken as a culture, sort of our search for meaning, and put that into politics, right? Not governance, politics. I would say there's no legislative fix to that. I mean, I mentioned national service as one avenue that would chip away at the edges. But I just think of all of this is why I'm so glad for things to be reopening on just an emotional level, right? For Pete's sake, go to church, watch sports, right? If you're looking for meaning in politics, if you're looking for meaning in kind of earthly figures, and that's your kind of messianic devotion, you will be disappointed. You will be led astray. There's an idolatry there that I think is we've seen the toxicity of, and this is on both sides, though maybe a bit more pronounced on one at the moment. But how we need more outlets, we need more outputs. There are kind of release valves that within a civilizational context, I think humanity demands and requires. And when you sort of cap some of those valves, unpredictable things happen, right? I think without the lockdowns, you don't have the riots that we saw over the past summer, right? I mean, there are just some things on a cultural psychology level, or psychology of crowds, maybe more so, but broader speaking, that, I mean, we are just in a period of flux and transition as sort of a nation, in our politics, but also if you think of just the acceleration. I mean, my grandma just turned 102.
Wow.
Right?
Wonderful.
I mean, when she was born, there were rudimentary biplanes, 15 years before. In her mother's lifetime, right, it went from first flight, Wright brothers, to we're on the moon.
I just flew from Chicago to Grand Rapids yesterday. I mean, when she was born, the travel from Chicago to Grand Rapids would have taken probably, at least, I spent 30 minutes in the air.
Yeah. No, I mean, so just if you – and we're – that acceleration, I mean, I don't think we fully process what that interconnectivity means. And to get back to the question, I don't think there's a legislative solution for that. I mean, I think there are some things where our philosophy and just everything needs to get to a better place. And the challenge is that, especially with the dopamine-induced orientation, there's no – I mean, my gosh, I look at the beds on my bookstand and how often I endeavor to sit back and read for an hour before I go to sleep. And probably I shouldn't be saying this because I hope to achieve the point where I get back into that flux. But how often that hour spent reading and going outside of my own experience and kind of getting into another rhythm and having this sort of centering opportunity, how often that is lost by an hour of scrolling, of doom scrolling, that I have no idea what tangible deliverable came from it, except that I probably found 15 new things to worry about, right? When we're doing that on a mass level, it's speeding things up that probably we should be trying to slow down so that we're getting onto a better path.
Congressman Peter Meijer, thank you so much for joining us today on Acton Line.
Thank you for having me.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at actonline@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Gabriel Jaja.